As the 18th century dawned, all the world's eyes turned to America. Once, the resources it promised its colonial masters was its main attraction. Now, the societies these powers had planted there rivaled or even surpassed them. As constant warfare plunged the European nations into chaos, which played out across the Atlantic, the people of the Americas, settlers, slaves, and indigenous alike, would increasingly take their fates into their own hands. In this video, we will see how the colonization in the Americas after 1700 descended into chaotic warfare and violent revolution that spelled the end of one age and the dawn of another. By 1776, the map of the American continent and the course of history will be changed forever. The 18th century got off to an auspicious start when every major European nation fell into a bloody conflict over the Spanish throne. The death of Charles II of Spain in November 1700 left a succession crisis for Spain. Charles and France backed the inheritance of 17-year-old Philippe of Anjou, a grandson of Louis XIV. Such a close union between France and Spain was unacceptable to the other European powers, especially Britain, the Dutch, and the Holy Roman Empire, triggering the War of Spanish Succession. Most of the fighting played out in Europe, but by now, any European war was also a colonial war, and the American theater of conflict became known as Queen Anne's War. The British, with their native allies, fought fiercely against the French and Spanish with their native allies. The most significant developments of the war saw the British capture the French province of Acadia, comprising modern-day Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island in 1710. Fighting ended with the Peace of Utrecht in 1713. Philippe kept his Spanish throne, but lost a lot of his European territory. In the Americas, the war had two major consequences. First, the permanent French loss of Acadia, Newfoundland, and Hudson Bay to the British, and second, the granting of the Asiento de Negras to Britain by Spain. The Asiento granted Britain the exclusive right to sell African slaves to the Spanish Empire. Spain kept its American empire intact, but the concession reduced Spain to humiliating dependence upon Britain for a key piece of its economy. Emerging from the War of Spanish Succession, Spain had taken a beating, but Philippe V was secure on his throne. The war had demonstrated that Spain's economy and navy had fallen far behind its rivals. Philippe's long reign was one of internal reforms to modernize and improve Spain's government, military, and economy, which he did with mixed success. He also pushed to expand Spain's American empire, especially into Texas, where San Antonio was founded in 1718. Key to Spanish imperialism across the New World were the Jesuits. This Catholic order took the lead in missionary work and education on Spain's imperial frontier. Many of the frontier settlements and native outreach communities were run by Jesuits, and they were often the main link between native subjects and colonial powers. However, due to changing attitudes in Catholicism and controversies about Jesuit power, the Jesuits fell out of favor with Catholic Europe by the mid-18th century. In 1750, as part of the Treaty of Madrid, Spain tried to exchange several Jesuit mission communities in Paraguay with Portugal for more valuable territory. The Jesuits, angry at being abandoned and with strong influence over the native Guarani, incited the Guarani to rebel. The Guarani Wars saw Portugal and Spain team up for several years to suppress the local revolt, and when all was said and done, they laid the blame firmly on the Jesuits. In 1767, they were expelled from all parts of the empire and their property seized by the crown. In the long run, this would be disastrous for Spanish-native relations and would contribute to the weakening of Spanish imperial authority that would eventually allow for independence. There were other signs of weakness too. The gold and silver mines of Peru, which had made Spanish colonization so profitable at first, were drying up. by the mid-18th century. The native Inca were also restless, with dozens of localized rebellions against Spanish rule that caused much anxiety and disruption. Peru's wealth and importance declined in turn, and focus shifted to other areas of colonization. As if to prove this, in 1776, the territory of Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and most of Chile was split off from the declining Viceroyalty of Peru and reorganized into the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata. Spain also tried to compensate for its imperial decline with California, which saw its first major settlements at San Diego in 1769, Los Angeles in 1771, and San Francisco in 1776. But Spanish settlement there was always an afterthought, and they never did discover the golds that would one day make the region so prosperous. Things were a bit more stable for Portugal, who avoided getting embroiled in most of the colonial wars in the Americas. Its secure position down in Brazil and lack of ambition elsewhere minimized conflicts with Britain, France, and Spain. The Treaty of Madrid in 1750 firmly recognized Portuguese and Spanish interests in South America, reducing the risk of conflict even more. As a result, Portuguese colonial affairs were relatively low-key compared to the history-shaping events going on elsewhere. The discovery of gold had triggered a gold rush in the early 18th century that dominated affairs in Brazil. The discovery of diamonds in 1729 only reinforced the pivot away from sugar, the center of which had now shifted to the Caribbean in favor of mining. Reflecting this shift, the colonial capital moved from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro in 1763 to be closer to the mining areas. These mines had no less need for slaves than the plantations did. Brazil continued to be the primary destination for African slaves heading to the New World, with almost 2 million of them imported to Brazil over the 18th century. This continued expansion of the African population prompted harsher racial laws to rigidly define racial hierarchy. Europeans at the top, mestizos below, Africans below that, and the indigenous peoples last of all. Portuguese attempts to forcibly subjugate this dwindling indigenous population, as expressed through the Digitorio dos Indios laws of 1757, only further destroyed indigenous communities with violence, forced resettlement, and legal discrimination. But the pivotal events of this period would come from the north. So let's pivot back to the British. The early 18th century was the golden age of Britain's American empire, but the cracks that would break it were already visible. Each British colony had different government arrangements. Each colony's assembly and governor, if they had either, could expect different powers and privileges. While Britain tried to assert more centralized control through royal governors, realities on the ground prevented the establishment of consistent administrative structure. For example, the Crown could disallow most colonial laws, but not those of Connecticut or Rhode Island. Royal governors regularly butted heads with the elected colonial assemblies, who each saw their legitimacy drawn from different sources. The former from the crown, the latter from the people. These inconsistent governing arrangements were a nuisance. Take, for example, the founding of Britain's 13th American colony in Georgia in 1732. Initially controlled by a board of trustees, the state had no single governor and no right to an elected assembly. The leader of the trustees, James Oglethorpe, envisioned it as a settler colony for debtors and convicts who could be granted small parcels of land by the trustees. It was also conveniently placed to act as a buffer between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. Most settlers ended up being regular colonists, not convicts, and for some reason they weren't happy with the prospect of being human shields for Carolina on tiny portions of land with no right to representation. The Georgia colonists complained relentlessly and frequently defied the trustees. The trustees gave up and handed over the colony to the Crown to be its problem instead. Conflict with native groups was also a persistent problem. In Carolina, war with indigenous peoples coupled with drought and local unrest raised the possibility of abandoning the territory entirely. The ruling proprietors chose to sell North Carolina back to the Crown while keeping South Carolina with its valuable plantations. The South Carolinians dug in and waged their own war against local indigenous groups. With the support of the Cherokee, the South Carolinians brutally suppressed the Yamasee, the Creeks, and the Tuscarora, virtually purging Carolina of those groups, but at the cost of about 7% of the white population. The Tuscarora were forced to flee north, where they sought sanctuary with the Iroquois, who admitted them as the sixth nation in their confederacy, much to the anger of the French and English, who knew the Tuscarora had no love for Europeans. Regional problems aside, the picture for the American colonies was still very positive. The population was growing rapidly, from about 210,000 in 1690 to 445,000 in 1720, and 1.2 million by 1750. Most of this growth was natural reproduction rather than immigration. For example, while only 19% of Chesapeake's Bay white population had been born there in 1668, it was 90% by 1750. These growing colonies began spreading inland too, with the first European settlers heading into Shenandoah Valley and opening the doorways for further westward settlement in the late 18th and early 19th century. Then there were the cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, which could support even larger populations thanks to the prosperous agriculture around them. By the mid-18th century, around 10% of Americans were city dwellers, a sharp increase from early colonial days and a number that would only keep rising. Moreover, it was a good life. The average white American settler could expect to own more land than a European, pay less tax than a European, and have a greater say in government affairs than a European, as long as they were a white male, of course. While European cities were piecemeal evolutions stretching back centuries, American cities were modern constructs, often built to a plan and integrated with modern conveniences like pavements, libraries, and large ports, befitting of a modern trading nation. It is no wonder that many Americans had come to believe that life in the colonies was far superior in many measures than life in Europe. This was certainly the opinion of Benjamin Franklin, who wrote with pride that every man in New England has a vote in public affairs, lives in a tidy, warm house, and has plenty of good food and fuel. Still, he conceded that the Americans were lacking to their English brethren in matter of manners, etiquette, and virtue. This, however, was a problem Franklin did his fair share in addressing through the foundation of newspapers, colleges, and philosophical societies in his native Philadelphia. Of course, there were plenty of slaves who would not paint such a rosy picture of American life. By 1750, there were around 250,000 slaves in the 13 North American colonies, mostly in Carolina, Georgia, Maryland, and Virginia. These slaves experienced harsh legal discrimination with slim prospects of ever buying their freedom. The small, free black population was a distant aspiration for the average slave, and many of those free blacks secured their status through their own participation in slave exploitation. Slave resistance was common. Attempted escapes, work avoidance, and other small-scale refusal to accept their condition was to be expected, but large-scale slave revolts were rare. When they did happen, they were usually brief and bloody for everyone involved. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 is a perfect example of this. Several dozen slaves, mostly of Angolan origin, set out from the Stono River in South Carolina in a desperate march towards Spanish Florida, where all escaped British slaves were promised amnesty. The escaping slaves killed several dozen whites along the way before being intercepted by slave catchers at the Edisto River. Most of the rebel slaves went down fighting. The most consistently effective slave resistance was found down in the Caribbean, especially in Jamaica, where escaped slaves managed to form Maroon societies in the interior which resisted British efforts to recapture them. Between 1728 and 1740, the Jamaican Maroons under Captain Cudjoe in the west and Nanny in the east managed to successfully fend off British troops until the British were forced to recognize their nominal independence. The British agreed to leave the Maroons alone, so long as the Maroons stopped raiding plantations or helping slaves escape. That was great news for the Maroons, but meant little to the massive slave population who remained. By 1763, an estimated 1 in 5 people in British-controlled America was enslaved, and that number was at least as high, if not higher, when taking the Americas as a whole. The slaves in the Caribbean colonies were producing over 41,000 tons of sugar by the middle of the century, filling the pockets of their colonial masters and leaving nothing for themselves. With so much valuable trade and so many ambitious European powers, America could prove the sources of conflicts just as much as conditions back in Europe could. For example, in 1731, a Spanish Coast Guard ship in the Caribbean captured the English captain Robert Jenkins and sliced off his ear. The wounded captain took his pickled ear back to Parliament, who eventually seized upon the attack to assemble a fleet to sail against Spanish America. The War of Jenkins' Ear did not erupt until 1739, as the ear was more of a publicity slogan to mask the real concerns over trade in the Caribbean. Still, this new wave of conflict saw tens of thousands of casualties. The most significant episode of the war was the British attack on Cartagena in Colombia in 1741. The British force, composed mostly of American colonists, suffered tremendous casualties in the campaign and lost most of their men to disease or combat. The War of Jenkins' Ear dovetailed into yet another major European conflict in the War of the Austrian Succession, another chaotic inheritance dispute that managed to draw in almost every major European power. It played out in America as King George's War. Again, colonial troops and native allies were essential to the fighting. It was a force of mostly New England volunteers who won Britain's most important victory at the Battle of Louisbourg in 1745, cutting off French access to the St. Lawrence River, and indigenous allies made up the backbone of French raids into New York and Massachusetts. As much as 8% of Massachusetts' male population was lost between the War of Jenkins' Ear and King George's War. The war ended with the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, with no major territorial changes. Louisbourg was handed back to France, much to the anger of the American colonists who had fought and died for it. But what the colonists wanted didn't really matter to Britain, who was happy to exchange it for control of the city of Madras over in India. A good deal for the British Empire, but not one for the Americans, who found that their sacrifices had been betrayed in the name of imperial ambition. This disconnect between colony and imperial master would only keep growing. The war was a blow for France, who had opened the 18th century with a vast American empire and everything to play for. New France stretched from Montreal to the mouth of the Mississippi, and the French consistently planted new settlements across its breadth, from Detroit in 1701 to New Orleans in 1718. While the wars of Spanish and Austrian succession shaped relations with European powers, relations with indigenous peoples proved to be just as important for the French. The French continued their efforts to ally, incite, remove, or destroy native groups as it saw fit. For example, in 1722, the French missionary Sebastien Réal, who worked among the Wabanaki of New Hampshire, incited them to rebel against British settlers. France was angry about border disputes left over from the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, and realized that the Wabanaki would make a useful weapon against New England. The conflict raged for 3 years and claimed hundreds of lives. In other places, the French found themselves on the receiving end of native resistance. In November of 1729, for example, French colonists at Fort Rosalie in Mississippi were attacked by the Natchez after years of declining relations. The Natchez killed all of the men but spared the women and slaves before burning the settlement to the ground. Believing a native revolt was imminent, French authorities in New Orleans dispatched soldiers to destroy nearby native villages, even though most had nothing to do with the attack. The Natchez were eventually scattered, with many of them seeking shelter with the Chickasaw in the lower Mississippi Valley. The French continued to wage war against the Chickasaw, Natchez, and other native groups, many of whom received support from the British, while using their own native allies like the Choctaw well into the 1750s. However, the fate of French colonization in Louisiana would ultimately be decided by events far to the north. On May 28, 1754, the governor of Virginia dispatched a young officer named George Washington to push away a French garrison from the headwaters of the Ohio River. What was supposed to be a simple clearing mission descended into a skirmish which left a dozen men dead. When word spread of the encounter, both Britain and France escalated their military efforts and began preparing expeditions against each other. Washington had unintentionally triggered what would later be dubbed the French and Indian War. When another major European war broke out in 1756 over Austrian territorial claims, Britain and France merely continued their conflict. The wider 7 Years' War pitted Britain, Prussia, and Portugal against France, Spain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden, among others, and naturally, the war came to the Americans, with the European powers and their native allies trading blows. Initially, France got the better of the fighting in North America. The situation was so concerning that in June 1754, representatives from 7 American colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, met at Albany to discuss plans for their own defense and possible alliances with the Indians should France invade. The Albany Congress was the first time that representatives of multiple colonies had gathered together of their own initiative to direct their own affairs. This was no independence meeting, but some of its attendees, like Pennsylvania's Benjamin Franklin, would remember how effective such a model of colonial cooperation was in years to come. Britain's military fortunes recovered as the war continued through the late 1750s. In 1759, they went on the offensive, sailing an army up the St. Lawrence River and laying siege to Quebec City, which fell in September that year. In 1760, they marched west and wrested control of Montreal from France as well. Britain's gains in Canada and events back in Europe secured its victory in the war by 1763. The resulting Treaty of Paris was the death knell for France's American empire. Britain would keep all of France's old Canadian territory and its 100,000 inhabitants. Meanwhile, French Louisiana was split. Everything west of the Mississippi went to Spain, while everything east went to Britain, including Spanish Florida. Aside from a handful of small islands, France's American empire was over. However, Britain would not have too long to celebrate this victory before it too faced colonial collapse. Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War was expensive in both money and manpower. War debt sat at £161 million, and much of the fighting in America had been done by American colonists who felt unappreciated by the Crown. Britain also now faced the cost and challenge of managing an expanded American empire. As well as dealing with an unhappily occupied French population, many would be deported from Acadia to Louisiana, where they became the Cajuns. Britain also had to deal with the new waves of native resistance. Conflict with the Cherokee in Carolina in the 1760s, and the Great Northern Indian Uprising in 1763, which saw a coalition of native groups come together to oppose Britain's new dominance, proved that Britain was still in desperate need of money and manpower to secure its empire. King George III felt that the American colonies should pay their fair share for this. The Sugar Act of 1764 marked the first of a series of taxes and duties imposed upon the American colonists to meet this goal. However, Britain had underestimated the confidence and resistance of the colonies. The imposition of even a relatively small tax against their wishes triggered unexpectedly intense resistance from the colonists. They objected to the taxes being imposed upon them by Parliament, which they had no representation in. Britain ignored the initial objections and pressed on with the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Townshend duties of 1767 imposed upon a variety of goods. Altogether, the new taxes weren't actually all that much. The typical American colonist was still taxed less and experienced less government control than virtually anyone in Europe at that time. However, a fiercely independent colonial spirit had emerged. Wealthy, stable, and confident, many of the colonists felt that they had surpassed Britain and resented the mother country imposing anything on them. Protests mounted, and Britain was forced to send troops into American cities to keep order. On March 5, 1770, this decision turned to tragedy in Boston when British troops opened fire on unarmed protesters, killing 5 people. Discontent was now turning to anger. The Tea Act of 1773 was designed to limit the trade of smuggled tea and boost revenue for the struggling East India Company. Instead, it convinced anti-British leaders in Boston to march aboard company ships and dump 10,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. In response, Britain closed down all the ports. This had the obvious effect of angering anyone dependent upon trade and fueled anti-British feeling. By now, assemblies and elites across the colony were urging support for Boston, and calls for full-blown revolt were mounting. By 1774, a Continental Congress modeled after the Albany Conference of 1754 brought 12 of the 13 American colonies together to demand a boycott of all British goods. The imposition of more strict laws curtailing colonial freedom, known to the Americans as the Intolerable Acts, was the breaking point. Negotiation and peaceful protest had failed, and the militias were America's only alternative. In April 1775, British troops met American rebels at the battles of Lexington and Concord. The first engagement of the Revolutionary War went in favor of the British, as did the second at Bunker Hill in June. But Britain's victories only seemed to unify the colonists against it. The Americans tried and failed to incite Canada to join the rebellion, losing 500 men to a disastrous Quebec expedition in December of 1775. But that did not deter the rest of the American colonies. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress issued their Declaration of Independence, ushering in a new age of American history. It would take until 1783 for the United States to secure this independence through force of arms, but it would look back at 1776 as the moment the country was born. For better or for worse, by 1776, the colonization of the Americas had resulted in the birth of a new nation that would go on to shape world history. The independence of the United States foreshadowed the collapse of most European colonial powers. Over the next few decades, most of the rest of the Americas, from Brazil to Bolivia, would throw off European colonial rule and usher in a new age of American independence. It was, of course, an independence for the European settler communities who had conquered, displaced, or subsumed the indigenous peoples who had called the land home when Columbus made landfall not 300 years before. Colonization had irreversibly changed the Americas, and like it or not, there was no turning back.